Greetings, fellow Insomniacs, and welcome to Insomniac Gaming Theater. I am your host, the Crazy Player. Welcome to episode 0 of our Let's Learn series for Dark Souls 1. Now, we're going to be playing the Remastered Edition, but if you have the Prepare to Die Edition, pretty much everything I'm going to say is going to work for you, with a few notable exceptions, and I will do my best to point out where those notable exceptions are when we get to them. But we are going to start off with, if you are in the Prepare to Die or earlier editions of the game, the one mod I do strongly suggest downloading is the DS Fix mod, because it cleans up a number of graphical issues with the game and generally makes it look like an HD version of the game. Beyond that, I do not recommend any mods or changes to the game, because the point of this series is to learn how to beat the game the first time. And let me reiterate that. This series is for new players who want to learn how to beat Dark Souls 1 the first time through. If you are an experienced player, if you have beaten the game before, then this series is not for you. You are welcome to stay, and we will be happy to have you here. But all of the advice in this series is intended for new players who, for whatever reason, have not been able to finish or even necessarily start Dark Souls 1. Want to learn. That brings us to our basic principles going into this game. The first is, everything is permitted. Now, what I mean by that is, outside of glitches, exploits, and mods, anything that is in this game that the developers put there is fair play. That includes sequence breaking. That includes using items to get ahead. That includes any strategy that will allow us to defeat a boss. All of them are fair game. There is no such thing as cheese in Dark Souls. Why? Because point number 2, Dark Souls is not fair. Now, a number of players will tell you that Dark Souls is a tough but fair game. What they mean by that is that every challenge you face over the course of this game has a solution. There is a way to succeed no matter what it is that you are facing in this game. But that doesn't mean that success comes easily or that it is fair. Enemies will drop on us from out of the sky. Bosses will hit us hard enough to knock us off of ledges or knock us across the room or just straight kill us in one hit. This game is not fair and does not play fair. We shouldn't either. And that is why there is no such thing as cheese or cheating in Dark Souls. As long as we are not using glitches or mods or exploits, any tactic is viable in this game. Now, point number 3. And this is one that's going to upset a lot of more experienced players. But death doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many times we die getting to our objective. It doesn't matter how many times we die to a boss. We lose nothing from dying in this game that we can't reacquire, either by using the opportunity to get it back again by going to where we died and recovering it, or simply getting more of it. Because the only 2 things that you actually lose when you die in Dark Souls is you lose souls, which are the currency to both upgrade your character and buy items in the game, and loose or soft humanity, which is a subject we'll talk about in a later video. Those are the only 2 things that we lose, and there are places in the game get more of them. Honestly, by the time we get to endgame, we're probably going to have more souls than we even need. So, ultimately, death doesn't matter. You don't lose items, you don't lose levels. The only things that you lose, you can always get more of. And lastly, a word to the wise. The most deadly enemy in Dark Souls is gravity, and it does not discriminate. Now, we won't be able to kick bosses over the edge of cliffs, and mostly because either there aren't cliffs around for us to throw them off of, or they're too big for us to move over a cliff. And their AI is never bad enough to cause them to accidentally die that way. But there are plenty of mini bosses, just general random enemies, what have you, over the course of this game, annoying NPCs, we'll touch on that one in a later episode too, that we can just throw off of a cliff and they will die, instead of us having to fight them. This also means, though, that we need to be very, very careful about where the edges and ledges are in this game, because we never want to roll off or fall off of an edge or ledge unless it was intentional, and we made the calculated risk that we are going to survive the fall. Because too long of a fall in this game will kill you. Period. End of discussion. Now, character creation in Dark Souls is relatively fixed. You will, of course, have to put in a name. I'm going to name this character Maximus, because I've always liked that name, and because it means best or greatest. Now, the sex of your character doesn't matter from a statistical standpoint, and there is no armor or equipment that is gender locked, so choose whichever you prefer. Unfortunately, sex, physique, and even your character appearance, for the most part, does not matter. And I say that for two reasons. One, we are going to be spending most of our time in hollow form, which makes us look like beef jerky. And two, most of the armor in this game covers your character from head to toe, or almost from head to toe. So, you very rarely get to see much of your character, regardless of what equipment you're wearing, anyway. C'est la vie. Now, we're going to have a discussion. The two things that do have a strong impact on our playthrough are our gift and, to a lesser extent, our class. And I say lesser extent because each class is designed to set you up to lean towards a particular build, with a couple of exceptions. But none of them lock you into it. You have, once you start playing the game and you get past the tutorial to the point where you can start upgrading your character, there is no lock on what build you have to do. If you want, halfway through the game, you can change builds. And in fact, if you follow my guide all the way through, once we get to a certain point, we're going to be good enough in our primary build, whatever we choose to make it, that we're going to start branching out and putting points into other things anyway. Because we are ultimately going for what I refer to as a mega build, which is where we're good at everything. But first, we're going to talk about gifts. Now, always start with a gift, and if it is your first time through, I absolutely recommend that you take the Master Key. It will literally open doors for you to areas of the game that you would have a much more difficult time getting to if you don't. In particular, over the course of this guide, we're going to be using the Master Key all over the place. Get to places earlier than we're supposed to. I think it is absolutely the best thing a new player can do. A new player can choose as their gift, as long as you understand that some of the places that you get into, you're just going to run past. And in fact, once we get out of the tutorial, we're going to spend a lot of time running through areas we have no business being in order to get goodies. Now, the one class that does not need to take the Master Key as the gift is the Thief, and that's because they have one as part of their starting equipment. So if for some reason you decide to start as the Thief, which I don't recommend, but if you're going to do that, take the Black Fire Bombs as your starting gift. You're going to need the initial damage boost that those give you. But we're going to choose the Master Key. And then for class, there are a number of different builds in this game. And most of the classes point you towards a particular build. The two that do not are the Deprived, which is kind of I won't say a joke necessarily, but this is a class that people choose when they are doing a more advanced game and they want to give themselves a challenge. I do not recommend starting the Deprived. And the other one is the Pyromancer. This is for a few reasons. The first one is that the Pyromancer starts at level 1. Now, the way the leveling system in Dark Souls works is it's not like Final Fantasy where you earn a certain amount of experience and then you go to level 2, level 3, level 4, so on. Instead, as you accumulate souls, which are the currency in this game, you will be able to buy upgrades in your individual stats. And each of those upgrades costs a certain number of souls based off of what level you are. So, a level 1 character will have the lowest cost for their first upgrade, and therefore can more effectively change the build around to make it suit whatever they want. Secondly, as you might imagine from the name, the Pyromancer starts with pyromancy. It starts with a pyromancy flame and a pyromancy spell, specifically fire. However, unlike sorceries and miracles, which are respectively tied to intelligence and faith, the power of your pyromancy is tied directly to how upgraded your pyromancy flame is, which is an item in your inventory. So you do not have to invest points into a specific stat to make your pyromancy very, very powerful. You could do any other build in the game, and as long as you keep upgrading your pyromancy flame, you will also have very powerful pyromancies to use as you will. The one potential disadvantage to pyromancies is that they are almost universally damaging spells. There are a couple of exceptions, but they are mostly damaging spells. Still, that's okay. They do very good damage, so they're pretty strong. And then the last reason I recommend Pyromancer is because of the starting equipment. Now, let me be very specific here. The hand axe is an okay starting weapon. Get us through the tutorial, but once we're out of the tutorial area, I'm going to show you a bunch of different places to get equipment, and whatever build you decide sounds good to you, you will end up having a better weapon available to you. And the cracked round shield is the second worst shield in the game. The worst shield in the game is the one the Deprived character starts with. However, as I mentioned, you start with the Pyromancy Flame, which is great because you don't normally get the Pyromancy Flame until, I'm going to say, about a quarter of the way into the game, and starting with it is just awesome. Secondly, the armor that the Pyromancer starts with is surprisingly good. Now, yes, from a Fashion Soul standpoint, it is ugly. It is a fail. Okay? It makes your butt look fat. It's just not that great looking. However, as you might expect from the armor of a Pyromancer, it has good flame resistance. It also has very good poison resistance, because poison effects are also within the realm of pyromancy in this game. And poison resistance is going to be very important at a certain point in this game. If any experienced players are listening right now, they just had a shiver run down their spine because they know the area I'm talking about. We'll get to that one much, much later. And it has surprisingly good bleed resistance. So, yes, it is not good-looking armor, but it is very good from a statistical perspective. It has numerous advantages to it. Now, we're going to start talking about the various stats. And I need to make sure that you understand. Your starting statistics are determined by your class, and you will not be able to change them during character creation except by choosing a different class. Once we finish the tutorial area and get to the main game, specifically an area known as Firelink Shrine, we will be able to start spending points on upgrading our character. But until then, our stats remain fixed. So, there isn't a lot of customization in the beginning of Dark Souls. Nonetheless, I'm going to spend some time explaining the different stats and the different builds. First, we have Vitality, which determines how many hit points or health points, or the game just calls them HP. If you have played any kind of role-playing game, whether we're talking about tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons, or I mentioned Final Fantasy earlier, a lot of role-playing games have hit points to represent your character's overall health, or health points to represent your overall health. The higher your vitality, the more points that you have. And I will get into this more as we progress through the game, but each of the statistics has what is referred to as a soft cap, which is past a certain number, the amount of whatever it is it gives you diminishes significantly each time you upgrade it. That's mostly 40 for pretty much every statistic. There are a couple of exceptions. But vitality determines how much damage you can take before you die. Experienced players will tell you that vitality is not something you should invest in because you shouldn't be messing up in the first place. But like I said, this is a guide for new players. So, we will be investing into vitality, and if you find yourself dying a lot, then don't feel bad investing into vitality. It's your game and your playthrough, and don't let anyone else tell you that you can't make the character that you want to make. Next is attunement, which mostly matters to spellcasters because the way spells work in Dark Souls 1 is you have a certain number of slots that you can attune spells to. The Pyromancer, for example, starts with 2 slots. He only starts with 1 spell, but he starts with 2 slots. And each spell can be cast a number of times determined by the spell itself. So, for example, the spell that the Pyromancer starts with, Fireball, can be cast 8 times before you can't use it anymore. This changes in later games, but throughout the entirety of Dark Souls 1, that's the way it works. Next, we have Endurance, and Endurance is actually the most important statistic in the game. The endurance statistic determines the size of our stamina bar. And pretty much everything we do in this game uses stamina. Running, jumping, swinging our weapon, blocking with a shield, parrying enemies. Even casting spells requires stamina to use. So, endurance is extremely important because it governs our stamina bar. It also determines our carry weight. by which I mean you can have an unlimited number of items in your inventory, but whatever equipment you are using is your carry weight. So, for example, the Pyromancer here has relatively light armor, a weapon that is not particularly heavy, and a shield that is not particularly heavy. So they start at a relatively low carry weight. Some of the other characters start significantly higher, and that is the thing I will actually talk about when I break down the different character classes. And then the last one I'm going to talk about, because the others are significant to builds, and we're going to talk about them when we talk about each build. But every class starts with a certain level of resistance. In theory, resistance governs how much damage you take when you get hit. Unfortunately, it either does not work right or does not do enough. Fandom has been debating this ever since the game first came out, and it is generally considered to be a useless statistic that is not worth investing into. So, as we go through this guide, I will not be investing in resistance at all, and I don't suggest you do so either. Now we'll move on to the different kinds of builds. And each class, like I said, except for the Pyromancer and the Deprived, leans towards a particular build. Ultimately, you can start with any of them and make them into whatever kind of build that you want. So, the first kind of build I'm going to talk about is what's called a quality build. And when I first started playing this game, I was a little confused by this term because I couldn't find an explanation for it. The reason is because the term quality actually comes from the spiritual predecessor of this game, Demon's Souls, which at the time of this recording had fairly recently gotten a remaster. In Demon's Souls, there is a type of upgrade that you can put onto your weapon that improves the amount of power it derives from strength and dexterity equally, and is called a quality upgrade. And thus the term a quality build has become the term for that throughout the entire Dark Souls series. So a quality build is a build that uses a weapon that gets power equally from both strength and dexterity. And because it has two different statistics that feed into it, even though the individual bonuses for each stat are not always the best grade that you can get, we'll talk about that when we talk about equipment later. It's a little hard to show accurately in the character creation screen. Excuse me. Because it has two statistics feeding into it, it generally is considered to be pretty powerful. And there are quite a lot of quality weapons in this game. Now that is where the warrior is leaning towards, and it is the class that the game will default you to if you don't choose any. The warrior starts with a decent set of armor, the longsword, which is probably the poster child of a basic quality weapon. It is reasonably fast, but not the quickest weapon in the game. It has good range, but not necessarily the best range in the game. I don't want to make it sound like quality is a middling build, because that's not correct. It is trying to do it is doing the best of both worlds. So the warrior is your prototypical quality character. Next is, the next kind of build is take either of the individual statistics. So we're going to start with strength here. Strength build is a build that focuses on, generally speaking, large, heavy weapons, usually two-handed, and most of its defense comes from rolling through attacks. So it tends to do high strength and high endurance and often high vitality, usually relatively heavy armor. And the starting class that most leads into that is the Bandit. You'll notice that the Bandit has a vitality of 12, an endurance of 14, a strength of 14, a dexterity of 9, which is pretty low, and doesn't really care about magic at all. It starts with low intelligence, low faith, and no attunement slots. I don't personally care for strength builds in Dark Souls 1, and the reason for that is combat in Dark Souls 1 always feels relatively heavy and slow compared to a number of other combat games I've played, including other games in this very series. Because of that, when you then compound having a heavy, slow weapon on top of the already heavy and slow combat in the game, I find myself getting impatient, and I also often find myself animation locked, which is to say the speed of the attacks keeps me from doing other things I would want to do. And the last reason I don't like a strength build for a brand new player is because most strength builds two-hand their weapon, and so their shield ends up on their back. And I cannot stress enough, especially when you're first learning this game, but also just generally, blocking enemy attacks and parrying enemy attacks especially is so important in this game. There are so many enemies in this game that a good shield will protect you from, and a couple of bosses in this game you can absolutely destroy by being good at parrying. And it's really hard to do that when you're doing a strength build. Now, that is just my opinion. If you like the sound of that, of doing a strength build, don't let my advice stop you. That follows through for all of the different builds and all of the different classes. Moving along, the opposite of a strength build would be a dexterity build, which is, as it sounds like, a build that focuses mostly on light, fast weapons and usually light armor. Now, because endurance rules your carry weight and is independent of both strength and dexterity, there is, strictly speaking, nothing that stops you from wearing heavy armor and using a light weapon, but most people don't. I actually am relatively fond of a dexterity build, at least that's usually the way I trend at the beginning. Part of that is because the weapon I enjoy using the most in this game is a dexterity weapon. And also because I feel like the speed of the weapon attacks tends to not lock you in as hard as some of the other weapons in this game. Now, if you want to do a primarily dexterity build, there are actually several classes that are viable for this. Kind of the archetypical one is the Wanderer, who starts with a relatively light set of armor, a scimitar, which is a light, fast slashing weapon, and a buckler-style shield, which is to say it's mostly meant for parrying as opposed to blocking. Like I said, I recommend the Pyromancer, but the Wanderer is a decent enough starting point. The next one that feeds into a dexterity build is the Thief, who, admittedly, in my opinion, has the best looking armor in the game, or one of the best looking armors in the game. But they start with a very short weapon, and yes, weapon length does matter in this game. Leave the jokes aside. And they start with a parrying shield that does not have very good block. I honestly think, outside of the Deprived, that the Thief is the hardest starting class because as much as I like the look of their armor, their starting equipment is somewhat lackluster. It is important, I will reiterate though, that the thief starts with the master key. So if you choose the thief, choose the black fire bombs as your gift, because you're going to need the offensive power. And then the last starting class that feeds into a dexterity build is the hunter. They start with a bow and they start with leather armor, but their weapon is a little on the short side, and their shield is, as I recall, it is actually a medium shield, but it is not a particularly good medium shield. Bows in this game are not capable of doing enough damage to be primary weapons. They're secondary weapons. And in our run through of this game, as soon as we get out of the tutorial, we're going to be going down and grabbing a whole bunch of stuff, including a bow and this very armor set. So those are the primary physical builds: quality, strength, and dexterity. Next, we have the more spellcastery builds. We have an intelligence build, and by intelligence, we mostly mean using sorceries. And so, as you would logically expect, the class that most follows that kind of a build is, in fact, the sorcerer. You'll notice it starts with very high attunement, very high intelligence, and an okay dexterity, and pretty much nothing else. Their equipment is a set of very light armor, a parry-style shield, a buckler shield, and a dagger, and then they have a catalyst with which they can cast sorceries. Now, I actually like sorceries for their utility purposes, but for primary offensive magic, I either prefer pyromancy or the few offensive miracles, because I actually find those to be more powerful. That said, many enemies in this game are devastatingly weak against magic damage. The problem I have with a primary sorcery build is there is no MP in this game like there is in a lot of other games. And spells don't regenerate unless you sit at a bonfire and recover all of your spells and your health and your use of your health items. Because of that, it is very easy if you are doing a primary sorcery build to find yourself out of offense, in which case you're just going to resort to a weapon. And if you... I'm trying to think of how to say this right. I prefer to start with a certain amount of physical offense and add sorceries on if that is the path that I want to go, rather than starting primarily sorcery and then trying to bring up my physical offense, if that makes sense. Lastly, we have a faith build, which mostly focuses on miracles. And as you might imagine, the cleric is the prototypical faith character. High faith, decent attunement. Their starting equipment is a light set of armor, a fairly decent shield, and a mace, which is actually a strength weapon. Probably influenced by Dungeons & Dragons is why they start with a mace. The problem I have with miracles starting off is their lack of offensive power. By about a quarter of the way through the game, which is to say around the end of the Undead Parish, for those who have some understanding of the game's geography, you can start to get offensive miracles, and they are very strong. And in fact, the build I intend to use, at least in the early part of the game, is a Dexterity Faith hybrid build. with Pyromancy for additional offensive punch. But I don't like it as a starting place for the same reason I don't like the Sorcerer as a starting place. I feel like it's better to start with a good physical offense and then move into miracles to round that out rather than focusing on the miracles. The other class that is a faith-based class is the Knight character, who does start with good offense. They start with fairly balanced stats, and there we go. A broadsword, which is a good quality weapon. They start with a good shield. I forget the specific name of the shield, but it's a good shield. And they start with a heavy armor set, and that's where I have a problem. Because they only have endurance 10, their carry weight with their starting equipment is relatively high. So, there are 4 endurance states in this game, or carry states, depending on how you want to phrase it. When you are wearing either no armor or very, very light armor. When you roll, you have a very fast roll. This means that in the middle of the roll, every roll in this game has a certain number of frames in the middle of it where you are invulnerable to damage. These are commonly referred to as iframes or invulnerability frames. Fast roll has the most of them. So if you time it right, if you roll through an attack, you can avoid being hit and taking damage. The fast roll has the most invulnerability frames. As you might imagine, the next roll is the mid roll. It's a little bit slower, but still has a decent amount of invulnerability frames in the middle. This is where most builds want to shoot for. Unless you are doing specifically a light build, you will probably find yourself mid-rolling, and that's okay. There are some subtleties in each of the different rolls. There are videos on that about that on the internet if you want to go looking for them. I don't want to get caught up in the minutia. This video is already long enough. The third state is the slow roll, or what is commonly referred to as the fat roll. The animation takes longer, but has fewer invulnerability frames, and you never want to be fat rolling if you can help it. Unless your plan is to just straight up tank the damage, which is extremely risky in Dark Souls. Fat rolling is never where you want to be in terms of the roll. And then the last carry state or endurance state is if you are over 100% of your carry weight, then you cannot roll at all. Never do that. Never. Unless you're just like looking at an armor set to see what it looks like, never do that. So, with all of that covered, we are going to choose for this playthrough the Pyromancer is our starting class. You'll notice the Pyromancy flame here and the Fireball spell. And the Master Key. We're going to choose that as our starting gift. And with that, I am going to start the game. I will see you next episode after the big old cutscene, because big old cutscene can get me in trouble with YouTube. And until then, get some rest. Thank you for joining us here at Insomniac Gaming Theater. If you enjoyed the content, feel free to give us a like, subscribe, or support us through the Patreon link in the description.